Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's show, Live with Sales Leaders. It looks like we've got a number of folks starting to tune in. As a reminder, this is the show that brings you sales and thought leadership from industry experts all over the world. Thank you for being here. My name is James Burnett, and I'm going to be the host for today's episode. In today's show, we're going to discuss a subject that's very important to me, and it's growing in importance over the years, and that's, of course, diversity. From a societal perspective, from an organizational perspective, diversity, equity, and inclusion continue to become paramount into how we interpret fairness and belonging, and certainly in the workplace. At LinkedIn, we take our commitment to this very seriously. And that's why this past year, we actually commissioned some research with our friends at Forrester to help us understand the impact of diversity on sales and sales organizations, the effectiveness of those sales organizations. And we went out and we talked to a whole bunch of sales leaders in B2B, asking them about their teams, their metrics, their DEI practices. And to be candid, the results are quite frankly staggering. So we're very excited to share them with you today. I did want to do a couple quick housekeeping details. There's going to be a recording of this show on our Sales Solutions page afterwards. We're also going to be doing Q&A at the end. So get your questions in the feed. Keep the comments coming. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And you can also follow the conversation on our social channels using the hashtag #LiveWithSalesLeaders. But without any further ado, I want to get right into introducing this amazing panel that I get to speak with for the next hour. And at LinkedIn, we do like to kick things off with maybe introducing yourself and sharing something that we wouldn't know about you from your LinkedIn profile. So Katie, Hang, welcome. Maybe Katie, we can start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, James. Really lovely to be here. Lovely to be here with you and Hang and to talk about this topic, which I think we are all really passionate about. And yeah, I'm Katie Tynan. I'm a principal analyst at Forrester, and something that's not on my LinkedIn profile, I really love to travel. And so recently I had the opportunity to take a trip to Iceland and drive in a camper van around the entire ring road of Iceland, which is just an amazing bucket list kind of trip. So lots of fun and something that I would happily do again. So if anybody loves adventure travel, highly recommend.
That sounds incredible. I think that's on my bucket list too. And maybe that should be on your LinkedIn profile. I don't know, but that's pretty amazing. Hang, over to you.
It's so funny. Iceland's in queue for me, hopefully next summer. So my name is Hang Black. I am the VP of Revenue Enablement at Juniper Networks, but more importantly, I am a very proud Vietnamese immigrant, author of Embrace Your Edge, Pave Your Own Path for Immigrant Women in the Workplace. And I want to be clear that I'm a dedicated mother, but also an unapologetically ambitious woman in high tech. I'm going to actually play with you a little bit. I'm going to give you two truths and a lie, which is
love it.
I ballroom and I do martial arts.
I'm going to say the lie is martial arts.
Oh, no. I believe the martial arts. I'm going to believe the martial arts. I'm going to say the lie is ballroom.
The martial arts is the lie.
In all truthness, I actually did study the martial art of Aikido for many, many years. But I'm glad I got that right. Well, thank you. Welcome to you both. Very excited to have you here for the discussion today. And I want to jump right in. So maybe, Katie, we can start with you. You know, diversity means so many things to different people nowadays. And this specific body of research that we just released is about diversity in sales. So in that context, can you maybe share, what forms diversity, equity, and inclusion can take in that context?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think it's a really good sort of foundational place to start, because a lot of times I think there's confusion of why we have all these terms, right? Why can't we just say diversity? Why do we need to also say equity and also say inclusion and also say belonging and also say all of these other things? And I think it shows the progression of the practice. So when organizations first started doing some of this work, they were really focused on diversity, which tends to be something that we talk about in demographic terms. sort of buckets of ways that we can segment the population and think about difference. But we rapidly realized that just thinking about it in that context was limiting, because people are different in different ways. There's a lot of intersectionality, and so it gets complicated really fast. And so what I would encourage you to think about as sales folks in sales organizations is to keep in your mind that all of the words we use matter for a reason, but the end goal is that we want to have a representative workforce, a workforce that looks like the people we're building products for, selling products to, all of those things, so that we can serve them better, so that we can create things and create sales opportunities that help those folks achieve and accomplish their goals. So in a sales context, it's about having a workforce, a sales force that is representative of the community that you're serving, which is typically humanity, especially when we're talking about tech products. And it's so important.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, it sounds so simple, but it really, I think we've seen time and time again that in order to serve customers, you need to make sure that the people building your products and bringing value to those customers, are representative of the folks that you're serving. So I love that. One of the things I really enjoyed about this study is that in diversity terms, there's kind of this it's the right thing to do. It feels good. Everybody's kind of on their journey trying to do the right thing. And we've seen a lot of research over the years about profitability and diversity's ties to profitability at the corporate level. But I really like that we got down into the function of sales, which is probably the most results-oriented part of a business. And this was really about positive sales outcomes. And I think some of the data showed that lead to conversion rate of 54% for sales teams that had more leading or more mature DEI practices. And I'd like to go over to you, Hang. What is it about DEI practices that we think makes sales teams specifically more effective? Because I thought that was really, really profound.
Well, I think it has to do with representation. As Katie mentioned, right? I believe it's actually a LinkedIn statistic that said that 80% of B2B buyers want to buy from diverse corporations. And yet, from the latest US Bureau of Statistics, 80% of us in sales are not. So when you have that representation, and again, when we talk about what is being a minority means, it's simply being the less population in a room. So it could be age, it could be tenure, it could be gender, it could be many, many different facets. So, when you bring in all that cognitive diversity, you get a lot of creativity. You see the blind spots of lack of cultural awareness. So, when I'm talking to my team, at one point, my team had 14 languages represented, and we could tell you directly when we're messaging, this messaging may not be appropriate in Asia. This branding is not very inclusive, right? So when you have that creativity, when we're all different, it makes us individually unique and collectively complete, so that we can represent, as you said, the market to whom we're selling.
I love that. I mean, that really resonates with me, leading global accounts for our sales solutions business here at LinkedIn. Every day, my team and personally, I'm connecting with people all over the globe. And there really is a sense of relearning or continuing to build more cultural humility and just a general understanding for me to be able to be effective, in that capacity. So I love some of those comments. And also we're in the midst of this great reshuffle where labor markets are changing. Everybody's been scrambling for talent. And when I think of sales, having been in the business for so many years, it's always about keeping those seats filled and making sure that you're able to get to maximum productivity as soon as you can. And one of the challenge that I think we've heard over the years with continuing to build diversity practices is just I don't have time to go out and build a diverse enough pipeline. I need to fill these seats. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the role that hiring practices play, and how we should think about this in that context?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question and a valuable question to ask, because I think I see a lot of organizations start with the conversation about hiring and say, well, okay, if we're trying to solve our diversity problem, the way we solve our problem is by hiring more diverse talent, which seems like a simple answer. But the problem is it doesn't work. And we know it doesn't work because what happens is when diverse talent comes into organizations that are not equitable, that do not have inclusive practices, that do not have an inclusive culture, they look around and say, I can't be successful here, and they leave. And so what you see is much higher attrition level, much higher churn rates for your diverse talent, as opposed to, and Hang, I really love how you framed this, right? Being a minority means being the smallest group in the room, that the dominant group, whatever that dominant group is creating those cultural norms, is creating that environment. And if I come in and I'm not like other people and I don't think that I'm going to be able to be successful, I'm not going to stay. And so solving these problems is not about going out and hiring some magical combination of these demographics that we slice and dice people into and saying, haha, I have the right number of this and the right number of that, and now my workforce is perfect. It's much more about solving those inclusion problems and particularly removing those equity barriers so that when you hire that wonderful diverse talent that's representative of your entire population, that they look around and say, wow, not only can I be successful here, but I'm valued for the perspective I bring, for my voice, for my ability to help this organization be really good at what they do. And Hang, again, I really love the word blind spot that you used, because what happens when you don't have enough diversity is that you literally can't see or can't perceive the problems that you may have in selling to a diverse community if your entire sales population is part of the dominant group. And so having the ability to hire diverse talent is great, but without those inclusive practices, without solving and removing those barriers, those equity issues, that diverse talent will not stay. And so in the long term, it just won't solve your problem.
Well, there's so much to unpack there. Before I maybe move into the next question, I'd love to double down just a little bit, and maybe back to you, Katie, or Hang, if you have a perspective here. I completely agree that it's not just about getting people in the door, but it's also about belonging and investing in that talent and making sure that they can be themselves and do their best work once they're in your company. What do you say though to the sales leaders that still may have the misconception that it takes too long to go find diverse talent? I run a sales team. I need to fill these seats. I need to get my sellers productive, and it's just going to take me longer to do that if I need to bring more diversity into the organization. Do you have a perspective on that, Katie?
Yeah, and I'll answer it, and then I know Hang has a really strong perspective on this too. So the first thing I'll say is my sort of snarky answer to that is, sure, go ahead and fill that seat and don't make any efforts around your diversity and equity and inclusion. And what you'll see, as our report clearly shows, is your sales cycles will be longer, your outcomes will be less, and you will have to be continuously re-onboarding people because you're rushing to fill that seat, you're ignoring some of these inclusion issues, and therefore you're going to experience more churn. So the short answer is, I think there are so many reasons, tangible reasons, why it's a bad idea to just use that excuse, which is what it is, right? I can't be bothered to find diverse talent. And instead say, wow, if I do this right, this benefit multiplies and multiplies and multiplies. So the better I do this work, the better my whole organization performs. Why wouldn't you make that choice?
I love that. Hang, what are your thoughts there?
You can tell, right? I look like I just swallowed a canary. So let's talk about this a little bit on 3 aspects. The recruit side. When we talk about there's not enough talent out there, we have to make sure that we stop hunting in the same grounds we have, which are typically elite universities. We have to stop using the same old fishing gear with old techniques. So we've got to think differently about where we recruit. I went to the University of Louisiana recently, and it's a university of 20,000 students. And I lectured to hundreds who were hungry. And these kids, they're overlooked because they've been underrepresented. They've been misunderstood. They've been, we have opportunity to go different places to recruit. We just got to be creative about it. And again, the more diverse community that you bring to the table, they will bring their network in as well. So then there's the retention side. When we want to retain people, when we look at, there's a myth of a broken pipeline, and it's broken. The assumption is, especially for women, that people exit the pipeline because the work is too hard. And it's just not true, because I was one of them. I actually exited corporate for a few years. The truth of the matter is, a lot of us exit because the politics is just too hard. The formulas for success out there don't work for us, because they weren't written for us by people like us with our human experience. And that's why I wrote my book, to share with people that you are not alone. And then finally, on the nurture side, how do we nurture talent to elevate them? When we hire, we can't just hire at the bottom. We got to hire for diversity at the top as well, to bring these people in, to show that, diversity is not a thing for HR to worry about, or for the chief diversity officer to worry about. Every single leader in the business should worry about it.
Yeah, lots of wisdom there, and I think we've heard many people say that when you look up and you don't see people that look like you, it's hard to see yourself be successful. And it's really, really insightful perspective there. So thank you for that. And lots of this work is driven by hiring managers. So when you think about the outsized leverage that people managers have, that are often driving the lion's share of hiring across sales teams or an organization, they become a critical asset in an organization's ability to, shape and build an inclusive culture and bring in diverse talent, into their sales teams. And I believe in the study that we just released, we saw more than 90% of leading companies have taken training to improve their DEI practices. Do you agree that manager training is crucial to DEI success in this context?
So for me, I'm kind of done with training.
I love it. Let's get controversial.
I mean, we've been talking about this for years and years. It's time for accountability. And that means making sure that your pipeline, that HR brings you a pipeline of diverse talent, 50-50, that when you get to the interview table, it should be at least 20% of your candidates are diverse, and the interviewers need to be at least 20% as well. And it should be an OKR, a metric that people are measured against. And I know folks are worried about tokenism, but listen, there has to be one before there can be many. And the problem is, when you have less than 10%, studies show that even very good talent have trouble accelerating their career, because they always look like the oddball, right? They're always the one singular voice that's different. And like I said, if we're diverse and we bring many different voices to the table, everyone has a different opinion. We don't fall into groupthink. That's how you move the needle.
Yeah, and I'm just going to pile on to that, because I was sort of clapping inside when you said you're sort of done with training. I think it's really important to understand where training fits in the broader scheme. So I would never say training is a bad thing. In fact, there's a reason why we said that training programs, especially learning programs for managers, are an important element of a mature DEI practice. So it's important. But I think one of the fallacies we see is this idea that, oh, we did unconscious bias training, so now unconscious bias is gone, right? Because we trained it out of people. That's not how that works. Our brains are naturally biased because we are human beings, and that's how we're built. And awareness of unconscious bias is helpful, but you have not solved the problem through training. And so I think continuous learning as an organization and keeping in front of people some of these ways of interrupting our own biases are really, really important. But to Hang's point, you also have to do all of these things within your business practices that make it possible for diverse talent to succeed. That's equity work. And what I always say is inclusion work is everybody's work. Everyone in the organization should be working on creating an inclusive culture and making sure voices are heard and doing all that work. And managers are really important to that.
Yeah.
Equity work has to be done by the leadership of the organization because it is the systems and the processes and the things, the structures within the organization that prevent diverse talent from advancing. So yes, look at your hiring processes and how your slates are created and how your interview slates are created. Yes, look at your promotions processes. Look at the practices and change them. That's not something that everyone in the organization can do. And so you've got to do that equity work in order for any of the inclusion work to actually have any effect. But training's important. It's not something you shouldn't do, but it's not the be all end all, and it certainly doesn't solve the problem.
Yeah, so there's definitely a place for it. So I don't mean to say, get rid of all training. That's everyone's responsibility. I completely agree with you, Katie, but it comes to life in the practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have to take it from, I learned this in my classroom or my e-learning or however you're consuming training at the moment. I learned this. Now what do I do with it? Now, how do I apply it? Now, how do I keep it fresh? Now, what does it mean to me as a leader, as an organization?
Yeah. And for leaders of leaders, how do I measure it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love this, this train of thought on more action, more accountability, enough training that you both are talking about. And I think for us as sales leaders, that's what we know better than anything, right? Sales is the function where you set targets, you go after it. We're very good at measuring objectives, looking at the inputs and the outputs. So why can't we see some of the same operating models, applied to diversity, inclusion, and belonging? If we fundamentally believe that this is critical and now supported by this research, that this helps drive those outcomes that we're all looking to accomplish. And your comment about bias training kind of becoming like an antiquated way, a check the box exercise. These training programs are sometimes seen as, just I've got to go through the process because HR is telling me to do it. When you think about how that can now, even today, not help a brand, when it's inauthentic, I guess I would say, how would, and I'll start with you, Hang, like how would you advise a company to ensure that their programs are authentic, and that you really are nurturing employees with that right level of authenticity versus just the check the box exercise? How do you do that?
Yeah. So I'll just start with, in general, when bias occurs, I do think it's not intentional. I don't think, I generally assume positive intent. But the practice, here's where programs fail. When we build programs without the audience for whom we're building the program for. When you build a diversity program to bring people into the table, are you building the future with the future? In other words, are you getting advice from the same group for whom you are trying to advocate for? I see very well-intended programs for years that I knew immediately would not work for me. It was, designed to make me into another white male, and I'm not. It doesn't celebrate the unique things that these other populations are good at. There's some cultures where speaking is revered. There are some cultures where silence is powerful. So we've got to make sure that when we build the future, we build it with the future, and we build it through allyship and celebrating role models. Like you said, if I want to have more sales leaders fill that pipeline all the way from the bottom to the top, I got to make sure that they have someone to look up to. That's often celebrated and heard. The journey, excuse me, I say it all the time. The journey does not end with an invitation to the room, because you have to be clear on your role. Everyone has to be clear on your role. Are you serving? Are you sitting? are you speaking? And for me, I want to be standing for all those voices behind me.
Yeah.
I think that's such a powerful way to put it, Hang, and I will sort of double down on that. And going back, James, to your question, the word I use, and it's not just me, we hear it all the time, for inauthentic DEI work is performative. If you have an organization that's going through the motions, that's doing a really good song and dance, it's obvious, right? It's obvious to the diverse talent that this stuff was created with no real intention. It's obvious because it's not being measured, because no one's being held accountable, because there's no budget. And so performative DEI work does more harm than good. When your diverse talent looks around and sees that that's what you're doing, they're really not going to stay in your organization. And so I would rather see organizations be really honest and transparent about where they are. This is where we are. We know we're not where we want to be. We would all like to be at the finish line. And I think everybody wants to be good at this. And Hang, to your point, I don't usually see ill intent going on. Sometimes you do, but most of the time it's, we want to be somewhere that we're not yet. So let's just pretend that we're already there instead of doing the hard work that's necessary to make sure that we are crafting programs that really work, listening to voices and getting that input and feedback and making sure that what we're doing is the stuff that matters, not the stuff that everybody else is doing or the stuff that looks good on your website externally, but really digging down into what do people need to be successful and how do we create that environment where they can be, every single person and every single voice. So that, I think, is the difference between what I would consider performative DEI, which is, hey, we hired a chief diversity officer and we put holidays on the calendar, checkity check, let's go on with our lives, versus meaningful DEI work, which looks really different.
Yeah, I love both those perspectives, and I want to maybe circle back to something, Hang, that you said around allyship, and this wasn't something that we had discussed really diving deep into, but when you're talking about sales organizations that are maybe earlier in their journey, starting somewhere but have the right intention, oftentimes you do have to rely on allies to really step up. And one of the things that I've found quite fascinating over the past couple of years is, equity and diversity have become a bigger conversation or a bigger part of the zeitgeist in corporate America. Is there's like what I would call like soft allyship, or folks posting, saying the right things, maybe putting something out there on a social platform. But then there are those allies that are really taking their allyship into advocacy. They're really helping carry some of the burden that typically falls on the shoulders of, the few underrepresented groups that might be inside a sales organization. And that can be really powerful. I've experienced it myself. And I'm just wondering what the work you've done in this space, if you have any perspectives or advice for sales leaders that are maybe early and don't have very diverse organizations, how they could be thinking about their own allyship or, allyship more broadly across their organization.
So that token person cannot do it alone, right? And so there's been a lot of good discussion around mentorship and sponsorship, but remember, those are very one-to-one relationships. The reason I'm so focused on allyship and role modeling is because those populations are the ones that can carry a whole class forward. When I look at allyship, if you have people in your organization that you want more of, then I would take those, give them an ally give them a sponsor from that's 2 levels above them in a different organization. That's sponsorship. For allyship, have conversations with the populations that are underrepresented. Like Katie said, ask them what they need and then represent them when they are not in the room. I tell you something, my little secret, I have moles everywhere. When I see something, I tell my moles and I let them have those conversations, not on my behalf, but for the class of people that I may perhaps represent, because it cannot come from the token person. It has to come from people who are like you to point it out, and not in a call you out kind of way, but kind of like, hey, just take a pause. Did you notice, right? And this goes back to, yes, take the training to learn how to interrupt those biases, but you've got to be able to practice it, and you can practice it in your allyship. And allyship, there's reverse allyship too. So one of the things I like to do is go to sales leaders as a diverse person. Here's something I can do personally, and something you can do if you're a diverse person. I go to my leaders and I introduce them every few weeks to someone, a leader in my network that may or may not be in the company, so that again, they can have those conversations. And what people find is, I just didn't know. I didn't know it was that much harder for you. I didn't know that these are the things that you have to think about, that it's not that you are shy to raise your hand. You just have to be a lot more judicious when you speak, because you don't have a lot of opportunity to.
Yeah. And I think that's so important to talk about that idea of allyship and the behaviors of allyship being to elevate the underrepresented voices, not to speak for them, not to take their air, right? It's the point of allyship is not necessarily to speak on someone else's behalf. It's to help continue to create the opportunity for those voices to be heard, and to use your position in that dominant group to bring a voice that maybe would not have had an opportunity to speak forward. I think one of the challenges we see, and I wrote about this a year ago in a report that I wrote called The Business of Belonging, that one of the strange problems of DEI work is that the underrepresented groups who are passionate about this because it's personal to them end up voluntarily doing a lot of the work in the organization. They're the ones that are volunteering to run the groups that are advocacy groups. They're the ones that are showing up on the DEI committees. They're the ones who are doing that heavy lifting. And what's happening? Well, that voluntary discretionary effort that they're putting into advancing DEI within that organization, which benefits the organization, is taking away from their ability to work on their own careers, to make progress in their own lives and in their own careers. So we have to make sure that the underrepresented folks are not the ones carrying the burden of doing the work. And that's the purpose of allyship, is to say, this is the work that needs to be done, and we all need to do it together. It can't fall on just these people because they benefit from it. Well, sure, but we all benefit from it. And in fact, we all need to do it together.
Yeah, and to your point, it actually hurts them. Again, studies have shown over and over that when you are advocating for a population for which you are part of, that's a minority group, it hurts your career. You get a political black eye for that. And sure, it helps the company, it helps other people around you, but it hurts the individual. So we need to make sure that, and that's why, the opposite side of allyship is to celebrate those role models, celebrate the people who are doing the work, elevate them, escalate them. And instead of, kind of letting people give them a side eye, or just kind of, shoo-shooing it as, this is just self-serving. We need to remember that they're doing this at a detriment to their career. And the allies, the benefit to the allies is tremendous, because when allies step in for a minority population, they actually get celebrated, right? They get celebrated. And what will happen sometimes, and as you know very well, Katie, the underrepresented create these programs, build these programs, and then who gets the credit for it? Right? The leader for whom they work. And it's, that's why it's really, really important that we celebrate the role models as well.
Yeah, I love that. And I often like to ask my allies a simple question of how much discomfort they're willing to get comfortable carrying, because I think, true allyship, when you're really moving into advocacy, requires a little bit of discomfort. And both of you kind of touched on this a bit. So my next question, and I'll go to you, Katie, is that building on this, you often do have, senior leaders or allies that are actually like quite well intended, but they really are afraid of where to start because of everything that you both just mentioned. And oftentimes the result of that is, you have leaders who may not lean in or really embrace kind of getting uncomfortable and jumping into trying to drive real change. That's authentic, I would say. That's not just kind of a check the box exercise. So where at the individual level or the organizational level, like what advice would you give to those folks who may need some help just knowing where to start?
Yeah, I think particularly for leaders, especially senior leaders, what I see is they're willing to say, yes, this matters. Yes, this is important. Yes, I want to do this work. But at the same time, even on other topics, leaders do not like to look like they don't know. They don't like to look dumb. They don't like to look confused. And they certainly don't like to feel like they're wrong in front of the people that they're trying to lead. And so what happens is they'll say, yes, I support this, go do it. And I'll be over here with my sort of pom-poms saying, yay, good job. And that's not what we need. What we do need is for leaders to show up and to listen, and not to feel like they need to talk, but to listen. Because, and Hang, you said this before, and I just want to plus 1,000 it, which is this idea of empathy for someone else's life experience. So we have done here at Forrester, and I know lots of other organizations have done this, we have done empathy programs where we have underrepresented folks come and speak about their experiences, and they come and talk about what they go through and all of these things. And I love it when leaders show up to those and listen, because two things happen. First of all, when you listen in that way, you gain that empathy, that understanding of the specific life experience that someone is going through. The second thing is you learn that language, you hear the language from other people about how they describe their experiences, about how they describe some of the barriers and challenges that they've perceived. And I think it makes those leaders feel more comfortable than asking questions and saying, wow, here's someone who's voluntarily sharing their experience. And if I can ask them a question, I won't feel like that's such a scary thing. So I think leaders having the courage to show up, to listen, to show that they care, and to say, be vulnerable and say, you know what, I don't know, so I'm going to shut up. My job usually is to talk. As a leader, my job usually is to lead. And instead, I'm going to say, I need to hear first. I need to listen first. So that's always my guidance to leaders is don't be afraid to show up. And when you show up, don't be afraid to say nothing for as much of the session as you're comfortable, and spend all that time with your ears open, hearing and trying to understand and trying to gain that perspective. But it is hard. It is hard. But at the same time, it's hard to be on the other side too. And so that's the empathy piece, is coming together and saying, how do we do this together? How do we all get better at understanding each other?
I really appreciate that and like that, because not only is it hard not to talk, but so many senior leaders, across all industries we're problem solvers, right? It's I'm hearing that there's a problem, my brain goes into type A mode and it's time to solve it. And I think it's a reiteration of some of what I was sharing, is that it's always not necessary to solve a problem in the moment, and in a way it's really making sure you understand what's really going on here. And that can oftentimes be that uncomfortable energy that I'm talking about. And it's like, how much of that uncomfort can you carry so we can start to build trust and understanding if we are to actually solve this, at scale and make some significant change. So I really appreciate those thoughts. Hang, anything you wanted to add there on this topic of where to start?
Yeah, so Daniel Pink talks about the higher power you have, the less empathy you have, because the way you got there is by nurturing dominant characteristics. So, I want to bring this back to the sales conversation a little bit, which is, at the end of the day, for sellers, there's a lot of good comments going on right now about the more diverse your population, the more creativity you're going to be injecting on how you pitch to prospects. And I want to reiterate that with diversity, it starts with just understanding different experiences, right? Get to know folks, really ask the questions. Who are you trying to sell to? What is their experience? What do they want out of a pitch? And it goes back to the same thing with diversity and understanding how to bring in more diverse populations. that's also how you understand your customer better, because they're being represented as well.
Love that. Love that. Well, I want to make sure we do create some time for some of the questions that are coming in through the comments. But I did want to acknowledge that the past couple of years, the sales function and business in general has been turned a bit upside down. And we're in this new remote hybrid world of work environment. And that can have some upside on DEI practices as it relates to the sales function. It could have some downside. I think there's been lots written about like the great leveling of the pandemic, but we all know that that's far from true. In fact, we see some of the divides that have always existed start to grow larger in what you call a K-shaped economic recovery. So I'm curious to hear from both of you, maybe starting with you, Hang, what impact do you think this new remote hybrid work environment is having on DEI practices as it relates to the research here in sales?
Well, there's always opportunity in chaos, right? So one of the things I talk about is I want to make sure that sellers always have their cameras on, even if your customer's camera is off. We have had an opportunity to level out. If you look at the screen, all three of us have the same size box. All of us have the same opportunity to raise our hand and speak. And even if your customer has their camera off, you trigger mirror neurons. If you're smiling, you're going to make them feel good. Now, this remote and virtual environment has led to less exclusion, but the separation has also made our worlds smaller and our echo chambers bigger. When we had to bubble together with a very small population, you're probably going to be with similar like-minded folks, right? That I can only spend time with 5 people. I better really, really like them. So, we have to be careful that on one side, we have less exclusion, but on the other side, we've lost a lot of empathy for each other. And we need to be careful to bring that empathy in. I always encourage people to turn their cameras on. You want a voice at the table. You want to see how people are doing. You actually get 65% better learning if you have your camera on, because you're actually engaged and you're held accountable to have to have focus. So there's a lot of benefits to what the world has come to. It's leveled the playing field as far as there was less access. There's equal access to leaders and therefore exposure. But now that it's coming back, we still have to remember that if you look at Harvey Coleman's book, Career Acceleration, he has a pie theory: 10% performance, 30% image, 60% exposure. And that's going to be true for sales as well as you reach out to your customers.
Love that. Love that. Katie, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting stuff that has come out of this shift. First of all, prior to the pandemic, there was this idea that so much work could not be done remotely. And we have busted that myth wide open. And the good thing is, for a lot of caregivers, and keeping in mind that not all caregivers are women, that caregivers across the board, first of all, felt a tremendous impact from the pandemic. But as we come out the other side, the flexibility, the openness to remote work, to flexible working, to flexible hours, to all of these things has the potential to be a benefit, a positive thing. The other thing we heard and saw in the research is that underrepresented groups felt like working remotely meant they were not having to be exposed to as many microaggressions as they feel when they're in the office with folks. And so there is a perception that working remotely actually was less stressful and less frustrating for that reason. So I think it's important to keep in mind, we weren't here and then we went here and now we're going back. We were here, we went here, And now we're going somewhere else. And that somewhere else, we have an opportunity to craft and design for the benefit of everyone. We have the benefit of learning from what worked in this pandemic environment and looking back at the previous environment and saying, you know, let's not have nostalgia for that. Let's not just say that was the perfect way. Let's say, now that we know these new things, how do we harness these to really be much more inclusive, to enable folks that maybe felt marginalized before, and also to create new opportunities for parity, to Hang's point, to make sure that we don't go back to a situation where we're excluding people who are working remotely because the people who are in the conference room have an advantage of that exposure. So my recommendation is be intentional about how you're designing your future state. Don't just try to go back to the way it was. Go forward to a new way that accommodates and encourages some of these shifts and changes that have been really beneficial, and be thoughtful about how you apply those in the future.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's such I think just in the most simple terms, look for the opportunity that this environment presents. And again, if we come back to the research, sales organizations with leading DEI practices see their revenue increase by 50% more than sales team with lagging practices. So in this changing environment, in this remote environment, what are some of the ways that teams can really lean in and leverage this opportunity to build for the future, versus just thinking about going back, I think is spot on. I want to, looks like we have about 15 minutes left. I want to jump in. We've got a bunch of questions coming in from the audience. I want to make sure we get to some of them. So why don't we start with the first one, which is, what are some of the ways that sales can educate themselves about diversity? Again, coming back to like, not only where we talked a bit about where do you start as an individual or as a leader that wants to get involved and help drive change, but what about just like resources? Where would you recommend people might go to just get more educated in a safe space? And maybe I'll start with, Katie, with you on that.
Yeah, I think one of the things, the easiest thing in some ways, is a lot of organizations are spinning up affinity groups and allowing and creating those safe spaces for people to have conversations to better understand one another. So affinity groups are always a good place to start. There are also a lot of public affinity groups that exist. And in fact, LinkedIn has a number of groups that exist for people to connect with and learn about and understand some of these different spaces and environments and perspectives. I always think those are good places to start. I think it's really important that when you're thinking about approaching diversity and equity and inclusion and learning, and I said this before, I'm going to say it 100 times and sound like a broken record, the first thing you want to do is go in with your ears open. And so anybody who's interested in looking at resources and engaging with the conversation, there's tons of resources out there. This conversation is very broad. It's going on all the time, every day. You almost can't miss it. But my advice and guidance would be, go in with your learning hat on, go in with your listening ears open, and see what you can learn, and have that help inform you where you want to go and what you want to do with that information. Because I think a lot of us dive into some of these conversations thinking we need to start off by telling our story. And that's right? Everybody's story is important and valuable and needs to be heard. But at the same time, starting with listening will help you see where the conversation is, and not sort of stumble in a way that potentially will prevent you from having those good, honest, empathetic conversations.
That's fantastic. And Hang, there was a question in here specifically for your comment on being tired of training. And one thing that we do quite a bit of in the sales function is coaching. And, I think a member of the audience was asking, in that context of being tired of training, what role do you think coaching might play around building more equitable practices in sales?
So I don't know that you can have like a coaching session just, with sales, we do a lot of role plays, right? I wouldn't do a coaching session just around diversity, but it's really living the day to day, right? And The coaching should come from, and as I mentioned, it is everyone's responsibility, and to do it very respectfully, and to give the feedback respectfully, and to receive the feedback very respectfully too. What I talk about a lot is when you can come in with open ears and open eyes, then you can walk out with open hearts and open minds. So if we allow coaching of each other, the problem with unconscious bias, it has to be in the moment. So any coaching and role playing may come across as inauthentic, but it's how we live our daily practices and coaching each other on when we see it in someone else as well, or even when we catch it with ourselves. You can actually vocalize, oh, did I just say something? My boss did that with me one day, and he mentioned it to me. And a couple of weeks later, and I asked him, when you mentioned this, did you know that my background is actually that? And he said, oh, that must have been an unconscious bias moment on my part.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, it's maybe a term that we use often here at LinkedIn is fast feedback or real-time feedback. After a team meeting or after an engagement, if there's a learning moment or a learning opportunity, where you really understand the intention may not have been negative, but the impact was maybe different than one had intended. Don't wait to get that feedback, to a peer or a direct report or to your manager, because those are the learning moments and the coaching moments that I think can be really powerful. I agree. We have another interesting question here. I'm not sure which one of you might want to take it first. Age bias. It's largely neglected as an integral component of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the decision-making dynamic, and it can hurt both younger workers as well as older. Maybe Katie, I'll start with you because the question is asking, did the Forrester report take age into consideration? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm going to get up on my soapbox for a minute because I think in a lot of cases, especially recently, we have gotten in a bad habit of generalizing around generations. So we use generational terms to describe different age ranges, and then we apply these really broad generalizations to an entire group, frankly, a very diverse group of people. Not all millennials are the same. Not all Gen Z are the same. So when we get in that habit of thinking about age in terms of these generational categories, we make some lazy assumptions. We make assumptions that are probably not actually right and relevant. So I used to do a lot of work in leadership development, and I used to have people come to me all the time and say, Katie, how do I manage millennials? And my answer was always, listen, they're human beings. How do you manage human beings? You get to know them. You try to understand what their individual hopes and dreams and aspirations are, and then you try to help them get there. So to me, one of the things we need to do when we're looking at age specifically as a diversity vector is we need to think about the different needs and challenges and goals of different individuals and groups of people. And we need to use data that's really, really current, because if you're looking at data that's 2 years ago, 5 years ago, that's bucketing people by certain age ranges, and their life stage has changed, then that data isn't true anymore. So I'll just use an example. We had all of this data for millennials when they first came into the workforce, and a whole bunch of people said millennials are like this. And recently I hear that same data being pulled up, and those folks are in their mid-career now, in their 40s, and that stuff just doesn't apply anymore. So when we look at age, we need to look at some differentiation. Are we looking at generations? And if so, why? Are we looking at life stage? Is that the pattern that's important? Because there are some inflection points across life stage that are really important to think about when you're planning inclusive work environments. Are we looking at other things and using age as sort of a categorization because it's easy to measure? So to me, I think it's important to recognize that there are challenges that are potentially age-based, but there are a lot of pitfalls as we look at data that surround some of these different cohorts and communities. And we need to think really hard about what the actual challenges are, what the problems are, and how we solve them. So that's my really long answer to, do I think age is important? Yes, I think it's important. Do I think we need to be really careful about age-related data and generational-related data? Yes, I think we do. And if you have questions about the methodology in the report, go download the report, and there's a whole bunch of information about who we surveyed and all of those good things in there.
Love it, love it. Really, it's complex. So I think it's a good reminder that we have to ask ourselves, what is the problem that we're really trying to look at here? Because it's not just as simple as age, for sure. There was another interesting question in here around how do you think about diversity in marketing materials? Which is really, when I think of, sales and marketing, or the sales function and all of the functions that support it, marketing being a big part, of the operation. Hang, do you have any perspective on what you've seen around just like how to approach that and how to be mindful of making sure that your marketing materials and collateral are, that there's equity and equitable practices in mind there?
So I'll bumper sticker this for you. It's important, and there's not enough of it. And again, we're not going back to the populations that we want to bring into the table to kind of get a pulse check on, does this look inclusive enough? But since that was a short answer, I do want to go back to the age question a little bit, because I think it's really important. Every generation typically tends to demean the generation behind them. Millennials, Gen Xers were called lazy. Millennials were called entitled. Gen Z are called disloyal. And we just need to remember that there's the opposite characteristic. What drives that viewpoint, right? Gen Z are very, very loyal. They just learn really fast. So you got to keep them interested, because loyalty goes both ways. So when we're talking about sales, we have to be aware, when we're recruiting and when we're selling, who is the audience for whom we are recruiting and selling to? And so we have to understand, we need to speak to their language in a language that they can hear. And again, with respect for where they are in their lives. Buyers are all across the age groups now. Our materials and playbooks generally cater to, there's an assumption of selling to an older audience, and people forget that millennials are in their, the top end is in their 40s, as Katie mentioned. So it's really important to look at all types of diversity going back to, how do you understand more? There are loads of books. Amazon has minority studies. It has gender studies. You can go in and educate yourself and just have conversations with your peers.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing about the marketing materials thing, which is the criticism that I hear all the time, right? So first, people will look at their website and their marketing materials and say, oh, we need to make them more inclusive. And then what we often hear is the diverse talent saying, gosh, why are we 10% of the organization, but 90% of the website? So be careful and thoughtful when you're trying to make your marketing materials more inclusive, that you don't do it in what I would consider an inauthentic way, and don't do it in an exploitative way.
It's great advice. Great advice. So we're coming up on time. I want to try to squeeze in one more question, but maybe I could ask both of you to be somewhat concise with your answer. This is our sales community on LinkedIn.com. How can sales professionals try to encourage change within their leadership or with their leadership? Do you have maybe a short one or a few word answer or bit of advice you would give them there?
So for me, I encourage everyone, and especially leadership, to look at their circle of trust. We all have them. There are 3 to 5 people that we trust immensely, and ensure that there's diversity, cognitive diversity, represented in there.
Yeah, and I'll just say, be accountable, be involved, call things out, pay attention, right? It's all about people not just letting things go, because the status quo always benefits the dominant group. So my advice is, be involved, pay attention, be accountable, call it out.
Excellent. I think those are both excellent bits of advice to wrap up on. I want to thank both of you. You've been absolutely incredible. I think we probably could have spoke for another hour easily. And I want to thank everyone that has tuned in and just everyone in the background that helped pull this session together today. We are going to have a recording of the episode that will be available immediately on the LinkedIn Sales Solutions page. And please continue the conversation. It's a conversation that needs to happen as we all try to build a more equitable future in the function of sales, and use that hashtag Live with Sales Leaders. And if we didn't get to your question, we're sorry, we just didn't have enough time. But feel free to reach out to myself or any of the panelists, and we'll try to make sure that we do address any questions that didn't get answered. And most importantly, if you'd like to learn more about LinkedIn's new report, How Diversity Drives Sales Success, head over to our website or check out the link on our LinkedIn event page. There's some really powerful data in there that supports this work. And we hope to see you at our next edition of Live with Sales Leaders. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your day.